Do you believe that the new evidence about possible gas attacks in Syria crosses the red line for intervention?
This is the news BBC were carrying today, that gas has been used in Syria, and President Obama said that was the red line for him. How should this change things, and should it lead to intervention? And I'd like you to be fairly swift in answering this, because I want to get one other question in if I can. Chris Bryant.
I'm not in favour of intervention. I want Britain to be very, very reluctant about any kind of military intervention that puts British troops in harm's way in this. I do worry about the weapons of mass destruction, and I understand that many people in the country may feel very troubled that we're going through a story that we went through 10 years ago. But I do worry that in a situation where you've effectively now got a civil war, the danger is that some of that might get into the hands of people that we certainly do not want to get it into those hands. I feel very angry with the Russians, because I think the Russian position on Syria has been disgraceful for more than a year, and if they had joined, and the Chinese had joined the international community a year ago, we might have been able to act in a way that prevented Assad doing the terrible things that he's doing in that country, without having to think about the dangers that we're facing now.
Philip Hammond, do you think the time has now come to arm the rebels in Syria?
Well, on that specific question, we have certainly not taken off the table the possibility of choosing to arm the rebels, and we've said that we will seek an amendment of the EU arms embargo so that we've got that flexibility to use in response, if necessary, to what is a fast-changing situation. Are
you influenced by this evidence of gas attacks?
I mean, with the greatest respect to the BBC, I've seen some video footage on the 6 o'clock news. I haven't seen any more detail than that. We've had some quite persuasive information coming out of Syria over the last few weeks, suggesting that gas may have been used, but we haven't yet had what amounts to concrete evidence of the usage of chemical weapons. Now, we need to apply quite a high standard of proof here, and we need to be able to go to the international community with evidence that stands up. All of us remember what happened in 2003 in Iraq. Nobody wants to set hairs running here. We have to be sure, if we go out there and say, what would be a war crime has been committed through the use of chemical weapons, we have to be sure that we have hard evidence, not a sexed-up dossier. We have to have hard evidence. And so I don't think that I have seen yet evidence which is sufficiently strong to persuade, frankly, a very sceptical British people. We know from survey after survey that the British people, as Chris has reflected, are very, very wary about an engagement in Syria, even though they are, I'm sure, appalled by the shocking events in Syria and the terrible treatment that's being meted out to the Syrian population by the regime.
Charles Kennedy.
Well, the evidence is inconclusive, that's for sure. And it's good to hear my colleagues speak in these sombre terms. It's a hell of a sombre issue, this. And it's a lot better than the way things were 10 years ago. I remember what it felt like in the House of Commons, being the only party leader questioning the Iraq strategy and getting scant support from either of the other two parties at the time. But we've all learnt our lessons. Perhaps most importantly, the American public and their politicians have learnt the lesson of George Bush. And I was much encouraged when you think what Donald Rumsfeld was like as Defence Secretary. The man who said stuff happens. That was his analytic perceptiveness about Iraq at the time. Well, his successor in office today, working to Obama, Chuck Hagel, has made categorically clear that whatever needs to be done, if this is the red line, and if it has been crossed, and these are two very big ifs at the moment, for the reasons that the Defence Secretary just pointed out, the Americans, and same for us, are not going to do anything that goes outside the parameters of legality. I wish to God we'd heard that 10 years ago from President Bush and his crew, but of course we're still, look at Guantanamo, living with the consequences of illegality. So it looks terribly serious, but we must look again and again before we leap. And I couldn't agree more. If we can get particularly the other significant members of the Security Council at the UN on board and get inspectors into Syria, that has to be the first concrete political steps.
Yes, sir.
I don't believe actually that this is about Syria itself, because I don't believe that Assad has woken up one day and decided to butcher up his people. I believe this is about resources that come from Middle East, from Iran, from Iraq, and so on and so forth, that Western world and the other Western world relies upon. So I really think that we shouldn't be out. We shouldn't be engaged in Syria. We should be out of it.
The woman in the back, second row from the back there.
I don't believe it's necessarily helpful to compare the situation in Syria with Iraq. Iraq wasn't justified. Our involvement in Syria perhaps is.
Julian Tett.
Well, the situation is very embarrassing for President Obama because he did draw this red line with the chemical weapons, thinking it wouldn't be breached, and it has now been breached.
Do you believe it has been?
Well, it certainly looks that way. As Philip has said, we need to see the hard evidence first. The one thing that's clear is that this is only going to get more and more embarrassing for both the British and the American government as you go forward, because precisely because you've had Western leaders essentially sitting indecisively on the sidelines, this is now spiralling into a much wider regional conflict, and there are not going to be any easy answers at all.
Peter Bazaldrip.
Well, it's very simple, and it's a one-sentence answer. We can only go into Syria, ghastly and tragic though it is, if we have international agreement. We didn't have it with Iraq, we did have it with Bosnia. That's what we have to have, and until we have, as Chris says, until we have agreement from Russia, we can't go in, though we need to go in.
You, sir, just briefly, and then I'm going to take one last question.
Just to pick up on Charles Kennedy's point, are the Assad regime ever going to allow international observers into Syria? I think that's a bit of a flight of fantasy.
We must insist on it.
Can you say it again?
We must insist on it. The international community must insist upon it.
But Assad will also have to go.
Them in.
Assad will also have to go.
Well, of course.
Yes.